The last person anyone expected to find between two loaded guns was a little girl in a pink dress. It was past midnight when returned to his safe house, his skin buzzing with the adrenaline of a hunt. He knew his rival, Han Mingyu, had breached the perimeter. His men were tied up outside, and the air in the hallway tasted like gun oil and impending death. Mujin stepped into the kitchen, his finger tightening on the trigger as he saw the shadow of his enemy in the doorway. He raised his weapon, ready to end a decade of war. Any other night, a confrontation meant a body count. Tonight, it meant something far more surreal. Mujin lunged into the light and froze. There, sitting cross-legged on the polished hardwood floor, was a young girl, small and slim, her blonde ponytail perfectly neat despite the hour. Between the two deadliest men in Seoul sat Yoon Era, holding a white plate of spaghetti she'd found in the fridge. She wasn't a bodyguard. She wasn't a trap. She was just a child focused entirely on her late-night snack. As the two enemies stared at her in a paralyzed silence, Era looked up at the tattooed giant holding a gun and spoke the words that stopped the world. "Do you have any more Parmesan? This is a bit bland." The standoff remained frozen in the amber glow of the kitchen lights. His neck and chest a canvas of dark, intricate tattoos exposed by his open suit jacket, didn't lower his weapon immediately. Neither did Han Mingyu, but the lethality had drained from the room, replaced by a surreal, heavy confusion. Era didn't wait for an answer about the cheese. She took another calm bite of the cold spaghetti, her pink Peter Pan collar perfectly straight, her blonde ponytail undisturbed by the fact that she was sitting in the middle of a war zone. She looked like a doll placed in a slaughterhouse by mistake. "Where is your mother?" Mujin's voice was a low growl, but the edge was blunted. Era swallowed carefully before looking up. She said to stay under the floorboards when the loud noises started. "She told me to count to 10,000. Her voice was soft, devoid of the jagged trauma one would expect. "I got to 15,000. When I came out, the house was empty and the doors were locked." Mujin's eyes shifted to the corner of the kitchen, where a loose floorboard near the pantry sat slightly askew. He felt a sickening jolt in his chest. 3 days ago, a rival faction had launched a botched raid on this safe house. His men had repelled them, and in the chaos, the staff had scattered. He had assumed his housekeeper, a quiet woman who always kept her head down, had simply taken her paycheck and run for her life. Instead, she had fled in a panic, likely forced away by the gunfire, leaving her heart behind in the dark. "How long have you been here?" Mingyu asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle for a man who had come there to commit a murder. "The clock on the stove changed numbers a lot," Era said, pointing a small, pale finger at the digital display. "I found the pasta tonight. It was behind the big silver bowls." Mujin looked at the child, small, slim, and terrifyingly composed, and then at the cold, half-empty plate in her lap. For 3 days, while he had been planning his retaliation and counting his losses, this child had been a ghost in his halls. She had lived in the shadows of his violence, drinking tap water and scavenging the scraps his guards had overlooked. The realization shattered something inside him. He had spent 30 years making sure people feared his name, building a legacy of blood and ink. Yet, in his own house, a little girl had been starving in the silence he created. He looked at his rival, Mingyu. The man's hand was still on his holster, but his eyes were fixed on Era with a look of profound shame. Mujin slowly holstered his own gun. The invisible child had done what 1,000 soldiers couldn't. She had made the great feel small. "The pasta is cold," Mujin said, his voice rough. He stepped toward the stove, his heavy boots echoing on the tile. "And we are out of Parmesan. But I think it's time we had a real meal." The silence in the kitchen was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of an impending execution. It had become the awkward, fragile stillness of two predators who had forgotten why they were hunting. Han Mingyu's hand hovered near his waist, his fingers twitching, but his eyes remained locked on Era. He looked at the girl in her tidy pink dress, then at Mujin, the man whose tattoos usually signaled a death sentence, now standing motionless by a stack of copper pots. "The girl is right," Mingyu said, his voice sandpaper rough but stripped of its lethal intent. Cold pasta is an insult, even for an intruder. He slowly, deliberately, moved his hand away from his holster and placed it flat on the marble countertop. It was a gesture of surrender, not to Mujin, but to the sheer absurdity of the moment. No child should have to witness what they had come here to do. Mujin didn't acknowledge the truce with words. Instead, he reached for a heavy pan, the metal clinking softly, a sound that usually preceded a skull being cracked, but now only signaled the start of a meal. If you're going to stay in my house without an invitation, Han, you might as well make yourself useful. The child hasn't eaten a real meal in 3 days. Mingyu hesitated, his sharp features softening into a look of disbelief. Then, with a sigh that seemed to exhale years of animosity, he stepped forward. He reached for a loaf of bread sitting on the counter, his movements stiff. The two most dangerous men in the district, who had spent a decade trying to erase one another from the map, were now operating in a cramped, silent choreography around a kitchen island. Era watched them with wide, absorbed eyes, her fork suspended mid-air. She didn't seem to care about the ink on Mujin's skin or the scars on Mingyu's hands. To her, they weren't monsters. They were simply the men who were finally going to fix the bland spaghetti. "My mommy says you're the king of this house," Era whispered, her voice cutting through the sizzle of butter in the pan. Mujin paused, his back to her. He had been called a devil, a tyrant, and a butcher. But king, spoken with such simple, unearned trust, felt like a brand that burned deeper than any of his tattoos. He turned slightly, looking at her over his shoulder. "In this house, Era, the person with the empty plate is the one who gives the orders. Everyone else is just a servant." Mingyu let out a short, dry bark of a laugh, slicing the bread with surgical precision. For one night, the war was over. The blood could wait. A starving child's hunger was the only enemy they both agreed had to be defeated. The scent of melting butter and garlic began to fill the kitchen, a domestic aroma that felt alien in a house built on the cold smell of steel and expensive cologne. As the pan hissed, Mujin handed the spatula to Mingyu, who took it with a silent, wary nod. Mujin then turned his attention back to the floor. Ignoring the protest of his tailored trousers, he slowly lowered himself, crouching until he was eye level with the girl. Up close, the oddly powerful presence he had sensed from the doorway felt even more profound. Era's face was soft and round, but her eyes held a depth of patience that no child should possess. As she looked at him, Mujin didn't see a victim. He saw a reflection. The ink on his chest and neck, dragons and jagged lines meant to signal his status, seemed to itch beneath the expensive fabric of his suit and the hardened layers of a Mafia don. A ghost stirred. He remembered a time before the tattoos, before the power, when he was just a boy in a cramped basement in Incheon, listening to the rain and counting the minutes until his mother came home with a plastic bag of leftovers. He remembered the specific, hollow ache in the stomach that made a piece of bread feel like a treasure. He saw that same hunger now, masked by Era's calm dignity. She wasn't crying or begging. She was simply surviving, just as he once had. "You did well, Era," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that Mingyu couldn't hear. To stay quiet, to find a way. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand hovering for a second before he gently tucked a loose strand of her blonde hair back into her ponytail. His touch was lighter than a breath. In that moment, the distance between the feared boss of the Kong Syndicate and the starving orphan on the floor vanished. "I used to hide too," he confessed, the words feeling heavy and strange on his tongue. "But you won't have to do that anymore. In this house, we don't hide the things we need." Era looked at his hand, then back to his eyes, a small spark of recognition passing between them. She reached out and touched the edge of a tattoo peeking from his collar, a sharp claw of a dragon. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. Mujin looked at the ink, then at her. "Not anymore," he replied. "The things that hurt are the ones you can't see." He stood up then, the transition from the vulnerable boy to the iron-willed boss nearly seamless, but the crack in his heart remained. He glanced at the stove where Mingyu was plating the food. The war between them was still there, waiting in the shadows, but for the first time in 30 years, Mujin had found something more important than winning. The scent of cheap, reheated pasta was quickly replaced by something richer as Mujin pulled a high-end smartphone from his pocket. He didn't call his captains or his enforcers. He dialed the house manager's private line. When the man answered, his voice trembling at being summoned at such an hour, Mujin's instructions were cold and absolute. Wake the chef. Wake the staff. I want the dining room lit and a 5-course meal on the table in 30 minutes. And find the finest imported Parmesan in the city. If it isn't on the table, don't bother coming back to work. He hung up without waiting for a reply. Beside him, Mingyu was plating the improvised spaghetti with an expression of stunned disbelief. The enemy boss looked at Mujin, then at the girl on the floor. You're turning the mansion upside down for a bowl of pasta? I am changing the rules, Mujin replied, his voice echoing off the wood cabinets and copper pots. In this house we do not eat on the floor, and we do not eat scraps. Moments later, the quiet safe house erupted into a flurry of activity. Sleep-deprived guards scrambled to open the heavy oak doors of the grand dining hall, and the kitchen staff arrived in a blur of white aprons, their eyes wide as they saw the two most feared men in the underworld standing over a small girl in a pink dress. The atmosphere of the house, usually thick with the silence of a tomb, was suddenly vibrating with life. Mujin walked over to Era and held out his hand. His tattoos, stark against his pale skin, looked less like threats and more like armor as he waited for her. Era looked at his hand, then up at his serious, sharp-featured face. She placed her small hand in his, her fingers barely covering his palm. He led her out of the kitchen and into the vast, chandelier-lit dining room. He pulled out the heavy mahogany chair at the head of the table, the seat reserved for the boss, a seat no one else dared to touch. With a gentleness that left his hovering guard speechless, he lifted Era and placed her on the velvet cushion. When the head chef appeared, bearing a silver grater and a block of aged Parmigiano Reggiano that cost more than a worker's monthly salary, Mujin stood over him like a dark sentinel. Is it the best?
Muin demanded.
The very best, sir, the chef stammered, his hands shaking as he shaved the golden curls of cheese onto Era's plate. Era looked at the feast appearing before her, truffle oil pasta, fresh bread, and sparkling juice in a crystal flute. She looked at Mujin, her expression still serious and absorbed. Is this because I'm important? Mujin looked at his men, at his enemy Mingyu standing in the shadows, and then back at the girl. In this house, Era, you are the only thing that is important. The old rules of the Kong Syndicate had died in the kitchen pantry. A new era had begun, flavored with salt, cream, and the beginning of a dangerous mercy. Chapter 5. The grand dining hall was silent, save for the soft clink of a silver fork against fine china. Yoon Era ate with the same quiet focus she had shown on the kitchen floor, seemingly oblivious to the two monsters flanking her. Sat to her right, his tattooed hand resting on the mahogany table, while Han Mingyu sat to her left, his conventional black suit and tie a sharp contrast to the bold, ink-covered skin of his host. The air between the two men was still charged, but the killing intent had been replaced by a heavy, mutual realization. For years, they had traded blood for concrete, fighting over shipping lanes and district borders that now felt like playground squabbles in the presence of the girl's absolute innocence. We were going to turn this room into a tomb tonight, Mingyu said, his voice barely a whisper. He watched Era carefully navigate a swirl of spaghetti. My men are still waiting for my signal. Your men are waiting for yours. And for what? Another block of territory? Another warehouse? Mujin didn't look away from Era. He saw the way she didn't flinch when a guard moved in the shadows, her trust in the world so complete it was terrifying. If we had fired, Mujin said, his voice gravelly and low, this is the last thing she would have seen. Two men she thought were kings, acting like animals. The irony wasn't lost on them. They were the architects of the very world that had forced Era into a floorboard hiding spot. Their wars had created the loud noises that made her mother flee in terror. By fighting for everything, they had nearly destroyed the only thing that actually mattered, the safety of a child who just wanted Parmesan cheese. The Port District, Mingyu began, his tone shifting from a challenge to a proposition. The Western Docks. They aren't worth the sound of a gunshot in this house. Mujin finally turned his head, locking eyes with his rival. The tattoos on his neck seemed to tighten as he spoke. I want a demilitarized zone. Not just the docks, but the 3 blocks surrounding this estate. No hits. No shipments. No noise. Mingyu nodded slowly. It wasn't a surrender. It was a pact. They were negotiating a sanctuary. Agreed. If our business touches this girl's peace, the deal is dead. Era looked up then, her mouth slightly stained with sauce, her expression serious. Are you 2 friends now? The 2 most dangerous men in Seoul looked at each other. One covered in the ink of his sins, the other hidden behind the mask of a businessman. A long, surreal silence followed. We are business partners, Era, Mujin said, his hand twitching as if wanting to reach for his gun, but instead reaching for a napkin to hand to her. And tonight, our only business is making sure you finish your dinner. The dinner had ended, but the transformation of the Torino estate was only beginning. As the heavy mahogany chair scraped back against the marble floor, 100 eyes seemed to watch from the periphery of the shadows. Stood tall, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket so that the ink on his chest was partially veiled, though the dragon on his neck still glared with predatory intent. He didn't signal for a guard to take the child. Instead, he reached down and offered his hand. Era took it without hesitation, her small, pale fingers disappearing into his scarred palm. Walk with me, Era, he said, his voice carrying through the vaulted ceiling of the dining hall like a decree. They exited the hall and entered the grand foyer, where dozens of soldiers stood in rigid formation. These were men who had seen Mujin execute traitors without blinking, men who lived by a code of absolute strength and zero sentiment. As the heavy double doors swung open, a collective breath seemed to catch in the room. The sight was jarring. Their cold, tattooed sovereign walking at a glacial pace to match the short strides of a girl in a bright pink dress. Mujin didn't look at his men. He kept his eyes forward, his expression an iron mask of authority. But as they passed the captain of his guard, a man whose face was a map of battle scars, Mujin stopped. The silence was so absolute that the soft hum of the mansion's ventilation felt like a roar. Look at her, Mujin commanded, his voice low and vibrating with a new kind of steel. The captain hesitated, then lowered his gaze to Era. From this moment on, Mujin continued, her face is the only one that matters in this house. If she is hungry, the kitchen is never closed. If she is tired, the house must be silent. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will not just burn the city, I will start with the men in this room. The guards remained motionless, their faces pale under the crystal chandeliers. They weren't just looking at a child. They were looking at the death of the old ways. The invisible people, the leftovers, the scraps of the world. Mujin was elevating them to the throne. Era looked up at the sea of stone-faced men, then squeezed Mujin's hand. Are they all my friends too? She asked, her voice clear and unafraid. Mujin looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped. A ghost of a smile, weary and profoundly human, touched his lips. They are your shield, Era, and I am your sword. He led her toward the grand staircase, leaving his empire behind him in a state of stunned, speechless awe. The message was sent. The boss was no longer just protecting a territory. He was protecting a life. The piece of the mansion was a fragile glass dome, and it wasn't long before the first stone was thrown. Within 48 hours, rumors of softness had spread through the Seoul underbelly like a virus. A rival syndicate, sensing a crack in the iron armor of the Kong organization, decided to test the weight of his new mercy. They intercepted a shipment at the docks, not for profit but to send a message. A man who plays father is a man who can no longer lead. Mujin received the news in the garden, where he was sitting on a low stone bench, watching Era attempt to feed the koi fish. He didn't explode in rage. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stood up, smoothed the front of his suit, and looked at the captain of his guard who had brought the report. "Stay with her," Mujin said, his voice as cold as a winter morning. "If she asks where I went, tell her I had to take care of some trash." He met the rival leaders at a rain-slicked warehouse, arriving alone. They laughed when they saw him, mocking the babysitter who had come to negotiate. But the laughter died the moment Mujin stepped into the light. He had shed his jacket, and the black ink of the dragons on his arms seemed to writhe in the dim glow. The air in the warehouse didn't just feel heavy. It felt lethal. Mujin didn't negotiate. He moved with a terrifying, redirected purpose. Every strike was precise, every movement fueled by a new, desperate kind of energy. He wasn't fighting for territory or pride anymore. He was fighting to ensure that the loud noises never reached Era's ears again. He dismantled their operation in a blur of violence that left the survivors trembling on the floor. He leaned over the rival leader, his hand tightening around the man's throat, the dragon on his neck inches from the man's face. "You thought I was weak because I found something to love?" Mujin whispered, his eyes burning with a dark, primal fire. "You were wrong. Before, I had nothing to lose. Now I have everything to protect. That makes me the most dangerous man you will ever meet." He left them in the wreckage of their own ambition, not taking a single one of their merchandise. He didn't want their money, he wanted their fear. When he returned to the mansion, he washed the blood from his knuckles and changed into a fresh shirt before entering the living room. Era was still there, sitting on the floor with a coloring book. She looked up and beamed, holding up a bright yellow crayon. "Did you finish the trash, Mujin?" she asked innocently. Mujin sat beside her, the adrenaline of the night fading into a profound, quiet peace. "Yes, Era," he said, his hand, the same hand that had just broken a man's spirit, reaching out to gently pat her head. "The house is clean now." The office was the sanctuary of the Kong Empire, a room where the air was thick with the scent of old leather and the weight of decisions that moved markets and ended lives. Mujin sat behind the massive obsidian desk, his eyes scanning a ledger of accounts that no longer seemed to hold his interest. The ink on his hands looked darker under the soft glow of the desk lamp, a constant reminder of the man he had been. A soft, hesitant knock at the heavy door broke his concentration. Before he could answer, the door creaked open, and Era peered inside. She was still wearing a dress of soft pink, a stark splash of color against the dark wood of the hallway. In her hands, she clutched a piece of paper as if it were a sacred scroll.
Muin.
"I made something for you," she whispered, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug as she approached the desk. He set aside his pen, his expression softening in a way that would have terrified his enemies. "What is it, Era?" She reached up, her small arms barely clearing the edge of the obsidian, and laid the paper flat. It was a drawing, rendered in the shaky, vibrant strokes of a child's crayons. In the center stood a tall figure covered in swirling black scribbles, his tattoos. Beside the figure was a smaller one in a bright pink triangle, and on the other side a woman with long hair. They were all holding hands under a sun that was far too large and yellow for the world Mujin lived in. At the top, in uneven, painstaking letters, she had written, "My family." Mujin stared at the paper. He had been given deeds to entire city blocks, tributes from powerful men, and keys to untouchable vaults, but none of them had ever made his hands shake. He looked at the scribble man on the page. In Era's eyes, his tattoos weren't symbols of a criminal underworld. They were just part of the man who made sure she had Parmesan cheese and a warm bed. The crack that had formed in his chest the night he found her in the pantry finally gave way. It wasn't a slow break. It was a total collapse of the walls he had built over 30 years of violence. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He didn't want to be the king of Seoul. He wanted to be the man in the drawing. He reached out, his thumb tracing the jagged crayon lines of the little girl's hand holding his. "It's beautiful, Era," he managed, his voice thick and rough, sounding like someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Do you like the sun?" she asked, leaning against his knee. "I made it big so you could see better in the dark." Mujin pulled her into a brief, awkward embrace. his tattooed arms wrapping around her with a protective ferocity that had nothing to do with war. "I can see perfectly now," he whispered into her hair. "Perfectly." The following morning, the sun rose over Seoul, casting a golden light that seemed to wash away the shadows of the previous night's violence. Did not go to the docks, nor did he meet with the Council of Elders to discuss the truce with Mingyu. Instead, he sat in his office, the drawing of the scribble man, and the bright yellow sun placed squarely in the center of his obsidian desk. He picked up his phone and made a call that would bypass the underworld and reach into the world of the living. "I need the best family law attorney in the country," Mujin said when his advisor picked up. "And I need him at the estate within the hour. Tell him to bring adoption papers." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Sir? For whose child?" "For mine," Mujin replied, his voice absolute and devoid of doubt. As he waited, he watched through the floor-to-ceiling window as Era ran across the manicured lawn, her pink dress a vibrant spark against the green. She stopped to show a guard a flower she had picked, and the hardened soldier, a man with a dozen scars, actually bowed his head and smiled. Mujin realized then that family wasn't a matter of DNA or shared bloodlines. It was a choice made in the dark, a commitment to protect a light that you didn't create but were lucky enough to find. When the lawyer arrived, trembling as he laid out the documents on the desk where hit orders were once signed, Mujin didn't hesitate. He signed his name with a steady hand, the black ink of his signature joining the black ink of the tattoos on his wrist. He was no longer just a boss, he was a guardian. He walked out onto the terrace and called Era's name. She looked up, her face round and serious, and ran toward him. As he lifted her up, he looked out over the city he had once tried to conquer through fear. He had spent his life building an empire of stone and blood, only to realize that a single drawing from a child was worth more than all of it. "Era," he said softly, as she tucked her head against his shoulder. "You don't have to hide anymore. This house, everything I have, it all belongs to you now." The girl who had once hidden in the floorboards to eat leftovers was now the heir to the Torino legacy. Not because she was born into it, but because she had saved the soul of a man who thought he was lost. Mujin squeezed her hand, knowing that the greatest power he would ever possess wasn't the ability to take a life, but the choice to love one.